Today, we are going to talk about the origins of agriculture. And in the background of this slide, you can see taro root, which is an early cultivated plant. This was probably first cultivated in South Asia and then spread through Asia and probably later spread to Polynesia as well as Africa. So it's an example of the fact that once plants are cultivated, they tend to spread from region to region. In our lecture today, we'll start by going over a hypothesis for how cultivation started from wild foraging. We will then talk about some centers of domestication of plants and some examples of plants that were domesticated in some different regions. We will go over some different categories of domesticated plants based on what they are used for. We will talk about changes to plants under domestication. In other words, what traits have we selected for? And we will talk about how plants, after they were domesticated, spread throughout the world. Agriculture started from wild harvesting. In other words, people going out and collecting fruits or seeds or other plant parts from wild growing plants. Obviously, we don't know exactly how agriculture started, but we have some ideas and evidence about the process. Most likely what happened was the start of agriculture was when seeds from wild harvested plants were brought back to camping sites or home sites, and then in the process of processing, some of those seeds were dropped around the living areas. Probably the living areas would have been close to good foraging sites anyway, and so probably the environment around those living areas would be reasonable for plants to grow. Because the living area would have people walking around and using the area, there would be disturbance to the vegetation growing there. And that's going to be useful because by disturbing that vegetation, it creates openings where new plants can grow, including the seeds of the plants brought back from the harvesting. Additionally, the soil would probably be disturbed for similar reasons, which would again help the initial process of germination and establishment occur. And so probably wild harvested plants started showing up in the immediate vicinity of living areas. From here, it wouldn't be a large stretch for the people doing the harvesting to start removing other plants to further encourage the growth of those desired species that were now growing in the area of their living quarters. Then another step that would be necessary would be eventually, instead of those seeds just accidentally getting dropped during harvesting, there would have to start to be some intent to keep some seeds and not eat them or otherwise use them, and instead to then scatter them the next year to help that plant grow back in the area in subsequent years. So by the end of this process, we go from individuals going out far away from the home site to look for food to individuals instead disturbing their local environment, saving seeds and planting them in their immediate vicinity. And this would be the start of agriculture. We just discussed how cultivation began, and cultivation is a necessary prerequisite for domestication, but these are not actually synonyms. So now we are going to talk about what we mean by domestication. And just to be clear, probably the process of planting plants started before domestication itself started. Let's go ahead and define this term. Domestication refers to the process whereby a population is changed at the genetic level through generations of selective breeding to accentuate traits that benefit humans. So if we break it down, when we say genetic changes through generations, we are talking about evolution, which we've already talked about this semester. So in domestication, plants are evolving, and they're evolving through choices humans are making. That's what we mean by selective breeding. And the changes that are being made are leading to traits that further human use of those plants in some way. And so domestication is really an example of artificial selection. We talked about artificial selection when we talked about evolution. We said this was generally when humans choose traits in some species or population, and those traits become more frequent over time. And so here we're selecting traits that are going to be favorable for agriculture. Now, when I say that we select these traits, this does not necessarily mean that we are selecting these traits intentionally. We could be selecting traits completely unintentionally. For example, if we were to harvest plants early, then we would get the seeds from those plants that first flowered and first made seeds, and we could select for early flowering time. But we could do that without ever knowing that we were selecting for early flowering time. So while we domesticated plants, this does not imply that the people doing it at the time had any knowledge that they were changing plants at a genetic level. This process of domestication probably started during the Neolithic period, which would have been a little bit more than 10,000 years ago. Probably the earliest areas were somewhere in the vicinity of 11,000 years ago. Agriculture did not just start in one place. Probably in an earlier class you heard about agriculture beginning in the Fertile Crescent, which is an area in the Middle East that we'll talk about momentarily. And this is probably the first place where agriculture started to happen, around 11,000 years ago. But this map also shows several other centers of domestication, including East Asia, like China, Polynesia, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Andes Mountains in South America, Central America, and then a little bit even in North America. So whenever conditions were right, it seems like people figured out how to domesticate plants wherever they were. The arrows then show where plants spread after domestication, and you can see that they didn't stay where they were domesticated, but rather spread sometimes over extremely long distances. As we've already said, the Fertile Crescent refers to the area of earliest domestication, and this is in the area that now would include parts of Syria, Iraq, Iran, as well as probably Turkey, Lebanon, and Israel. And the plants that were domesticated here, there's many listed in your book, and I've included a list of some of those here. This includes our earliest domesticated varieties of wheat, as well as chickpeas, which you might be familiar with as garbanzo beans. This is what we now make hummus out of. We have flax that was used both for seeds and as a fiber. Of course, grapes, which are used to eat and make wine. And you're familiar with onions and lettuce. We had dates from date palms. We had figs from fig trees, and olives, which were used for olive oil, also from trees. So a wide variety of plants. What I find remarkable about this list is that these are all plants that we are familiar with on almost a day-to-day basis today. So it's not the case that we domesticated some plants and then forgot about them and started eating others. Rather, some of these earliest domesticated plants are still very important food products, wheat among the most important in the world, even 11,000 years later. When we talk about domestication, we almost always focus on the Fertile Crescent because that's where this started. But I want to emphasize that this process was happening maybe a little bit later at many other places in the world. And so to emphasize this, let's just take a look at what was happening in Sub-Saharan Africa. We had several plants domesticated, many of which you would already be familiar with, or you would be familiar with. So we have sorghum, and which is the larger grain in this picture here, as well as teff, which is the smaller grain in this picture here. And these are both going to be grasses, and so these will be grains. We had a version of rice called African rice. We also had cowpeas, and you can see over here one variety is the black-eyed pea that we are familiar with, especially in southern cooking. There was a groundnut that isn't the peanut but is similar to it. I think we're all familiar with coffee, and okra, as well as melon and watermelon. So again, at least half of these plants are things that are still a major part of our diet, even in a very different part of the world. And that shows that domesticated plants tend to persist and move around. We now are going to talk about sort of the meat of today's lecture, which is what changes did we select for when we selected plants during domestication. So these are the evolutionary changes that occurred as a result of artificial selection. First, we had increased nutrition and increased edibility. And I think it's obvious why we would want those traits. Additionally, for things where we eat the seeds, we tended to select for larger seeds. Again, that seems like it's clear why that would be useful. We'll talk about the others in some more detail. So I'm going to list them here, and then we'll go through the remainder. We selected for a loss of seed shattering, in other words, seeds falling off of stems. We selected for a shift from being perennial in life cycle to annual. We selected for a loss of photoperiod control over flowering. In other words, plants no longer would monitor day length to decide when to flower. We selected for a loss of seed dormancy, so seeds could germinate immediately. We selected for an ability to self-fertilize rather than to require outcrossing. And we've selected for decreased resistance to pests and herbivores. Let's take up the first of those here. We selected for the loss of the trait of seed shattering. I'm going to change this so it's clear that it's the loss of this. And again, this refers to when fruits or seeds break off a central stem and disperse when mature. And so this is a very useful trait for wild plants to have. Once the seeds are made, they have to disperse from the parent plant so they can grow somewhere further away where they are not competing with siblings and not competing with that better established parent. However, this is a terrible trait for a cultivated plant because it means that the fruits or seeds are going to fall off before we have a chance to harvest them and take them back to use them for our own purposes. And so it's clear why we would want this modification. We also want to be able to collect plants, carry them to a processing site without the fruits and seeds falling off as we carry them. So in contemporary cultivated plants, most plants do not have shattering. Instead, the seeds will stay on the stem for extended periods. The problem with this is that eventually we do need to separate the seeds from the stems that they're attached to. And the process that we do that for, especially for greens, is called threshing. And here's a picture of what threshing looks like. This individual has a clump of stems and is basically banging them against a hard surface, in the process breaking off the seeds. So these seeds here, this is an ancient variety of wheat that's still around. It's called einkorn wheat. And in einkorn wheat, there are varieties that shatter and varieties that don't shatter. So these have broken off. Down here, this individual, I'm not sure if this is einkorn wheat or not, but this individual is basically banging the stems against the ground to then break off the fruit with the seeds inside, and this would be retained for further processing. The remaining stems would be burnt or returned to a field to break down. Another shift is from being a perennial plant to being an annual plant. Remember that a perennial plant is one that survives over multiple years and has some reproductive output in multiple years. An annual plant is one that survives only during 1 year and it invests all of its resources in reproduction before it dies. So the shift was from perennial to annual, and that might seem counterintuitive because annual plants have to be replanted each year while perennials don't. So why did this occur? Well, one advantage to annual plants is that they do not need to store nutrients year over year. This means that the plant can invest all of its resources into its fruits or seeds, or whatever plant part it is that we're harvesting. For example, a perennial plant needs a better developed root system, but that takes nutrients and energy. In an annual plant, they can make the minimally adequate root system and invest everything else into the parts that we are selecting for. But there's a second reason for this change also. There is some suggestion that agriculture started during periods when the climate was increasingly dry. That would mean that there would increasingly be, especially in the Fertile Crescent, a dry period during which plants could not survive. That would be a obviously difficult environment if you're growing perennials. You might need to mulch them, or you might need to provide supplemental water. If, however, you instead cultivate annuals, then you don't need to try to keep the plants alive during the dry season. You can harvest when it's still moist. You can eat your stored food during the dry season, and then you can replant when it returns to being a wet season. The next two traits relate to each other. This is the loss of photoperiod control over flowering and the loss of seed dormancy. Having photoperiod control over flowering, remember this means that the plant is monitoring day length to know when it's an appropriate time to flower. Seed dormancy refers to the period when a seed is made and probably has been dispersed, but does not yet start to grow. So the loss of seed dormancy means that the seeds can grow, the seeds can grow more quickly. For a wild plant, it's important that it be able to monitor the weather to make sure its decision to start flowering is at an appropriate season. And for a wild plant, seed dormancy can be useful because it can keep the seed from becoming active until the conditions are right to grow. But as soon as we start talking about cultivated plants, these concerns go away. This is because a human can plant seeds at the appropriate season when, by the time the plant gets to flowering, it will be an appropriate time. And the humans can plant the seeds at a time where the conditions are already correct for those seeds to start germinating. So there's no longer selection on the plant to monitor the weather in making these decisions because humans can do it for them. Why is this advantageous? Well, the loss of seed dormancy can lead seeds to germinate faster. Some wild seeds can take weeks, months, or even years to germinate, but most cultivated seeds take more like days or at most a week or two to start germinating. Obviously, germinating faster means the plants grow faster, and humans then can harvest the crop more quickly. The loss of photoperiod control over flowering can lead plants that are already grown to progress to flowering faster. If they flower faster, then they can make fruit sooner, and they can make seeds sooner. And so if this is a crop like a grain or a tomato or pepper or something where we're eating the fruits, then by getting to these stages sooner, again, we as humans get to eat the crop earlier, which is advantageous. The next trait that we'll talk about is the ability to self-pollinate. To put this in context, many wild plants require outcrossing, so they are more successful in making seeds if pollen moves from one individual to another individual. This is true of some cultivated plants, but it is less frequently the case. In contrast, self-pollinating plants, sometimes they can outcross, but they are also able to use their own pollen to make seeds. So why is it advantageous for wild plants to outcross? As we've talked about throughout the semester, this creates seeds that have more diversity, and it helps to ensure that at least some of those seeds will be fit for the environment. It also can help to get rid of mutations. Self-pollinating also has some benefits. First, self-pollinating, and again, this is what cultivated plants are switching toward. Self-pollinating can promote reproductive success even when pollinator service is poor. So we've all read about and thought about what happens when we don't have adequate pollinators for our crops. For crops that can self-pollinate, this becomes much less important. Now, we've said that self-pollination can lead to inbreeding, which can reduce fitness, and that's why many wild plants avoid it. However, for crop plants, humans are providing really good growing conditions. So we can do things like provide soil nutrients, we can remove competitors, we can disturb the soil to help the plants get their roots growing, and we can do things like pest control. So because we are providing better conditions, the problems that result from inbreeding can be minimized, and even if the plants do self-pollinate, they can still have a successful growth. So it could be that cultivated plants simply are less harmed by inbreeding than our wild plants. There's another major advantage that I want to get to about self-pollination. To think about this, let's think about what happens with a cross-pollinating plant that has just started the process of cultivation and is still growing in an area with its weedy relatives. So think about a grain plant, maybe something like wheat, and in cultivation, the mutation that prevents seed shattering has just occurred. And so now the farmer has some plants in his field that do not shatter. This is a great thing for him. The problem is that those plants, if it is still cross-pollinating, have a good chance of cross-pollinating with a wild relative that's still in the area that does have seeds that shatter. And that is going to reintroduce the seed shattering gene into the farmer's field. This isn't a good thing because the mutation that is beneficial for the farmer might not stick around because it gets swamped out from the weeds. Now think about the same plant, but imagine that it has evolved the ability to self-pollinate. In this case, it is unlikely to get the gene from wild relatives that causes seed shattering. So if it has this mutation that prevents shattering and it self-pollinates, then it can keep this gene that prevents shattering, and this will be advantageous to the farmer. This would be true for a whole variety of different traits. So what we're basically saying here is that by having the ability to self-pollinate, the plants then are shielded from having the process of artificial selection be interfered with by weedy relatives that still occur in the same area. The next change that we'll talk about is the loss of defense against herbivores. This is counterintuitive. It would seem that humans would want to grow plants that are unlikely to be attacked by insects or mammals or other things that might eat those plants. So why did this change occur? First, consider that defense mechanisms may be costly. For example, making armature, thorns, spines, or prickles, that requires an investment of energy that could be used for growth. Similarly, making a defensive compound can be costly. It's going to require energy and it will also require nutrients, for example, sometimes nitrogen. And that nitrogen could be used instead to do something like make bigger leaves or make more seeds. A second reason for this loss of defense is that some defenses can be harmful to humans. So if you think about a chemical that makes leaves bitter and reduces the edibility for rabbits, that might reduce the harm rabbits do to the plant, but it's also going to reduce the usefulness of that plant to humans who want to eat it. And so because these two things correlate, we'd select for less defenses against other things that makes the plant better for us. A third reason is that cultivated plants are selected to grow quickly. We like to grow things that will grow fast so we can harvest and replant. Chemical and physical defenses. So defenses generally are often associated with slow growth patterns or perennial plants. The idea is that a fast grower can escape herbivores simply by completing its life cycle before the herbivores get to it. A slow grower is going to be around for long enough that it will probably encounter herbivores, and so it needs to defend itself. So there's sort of two strategies, a fight or a flight strategy to dealing with this problem. Cultivated plants are using the flight strategy. They are flying through their growth to avoid it, while the longer-lived wild relatives tend to be more likely to use the fight strategy, growing slowly and defending themselves. The last thing we'll say about this is that farmers can defend plants. We can go around and pull off caterpillars. We can put up fences to deter rabbits. If we are defending the plants, then there's no need for them to spend energy defending themselves. So the ones that don't spend that energy and instead put their resources into making more seeds are going to be the ones that do better, and it's more likely those seeds will be used to plant the next year's crop. We will switch gears again here, and here we are going to talk about some different categories of domesticated plants. These categories are not mostly groups of related species, rather they're groups of plant types based on how we use the plants. The first one is sort of an exception to this. It is a category of use, but it also involves only members of the grass family. Remember that grasses are monocots, and the cereals or grains are the seeds we get from grasses. So by definition, if something is called a cereal or a grain, then it is coming from something in the grass family. And grasses are the most important group of plants for human food. They include all of the plants listed here. The ones that are most important are corn, rice, wheat, but then we also use barley both for eating and for making beverages. Millet is eaten in some cultures more than others. We use rye for, again, beverage making as well as eating. And we use oats and sorghum as well. Now, we're thinking, or at least I'm thinking about what humans themselves eat. But remember that a lot of grains that we grow are not fed to humans. Instead, they're fed to various animals that we grow either for products they make, like eggs or milk, or for animals that we eat ourselves. And so corn, for example, is probably more corn grown to feed to cows than there is corn grown to feed to humans. All of these are cereals, and this is not a complete list. There's probably another dozen we could add to it. Then there's a group of related plants that are not cereals. They are instead pseudo-cereals. Pseudo-cereals appear to be cereals, but they're not from grasses. They include various plants, including amaranth, buckwheat, and quinoa. I believe this is amaranth shown in the first picture, and buckwheat is shown here in the second picture. So they are plants that make seeds. We grow or we process the seeds and we eat them very much like grains, but because they are coming from dicots, not from grasses that are monocots, we don't use the term cereals. These plants tend to be high in protein and can be a useful addition to our diets. The next group that we'll talk about are the legumes. And the legumes, even though I'm listing them third, are the second most important plant group for human consumption. This is because legumes, as we talked about earlier in the semester, benefit from an association with nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Remember, in this symbiosis, the legume gives the bacteria carbohydrates as an energy source, and in exchange, the bacteria fix atmospheric nitrogen into nitrogen that can be used by the bacteria or the plant. The plant can use this bacteria then to make protein. This is important for humans because protein is often limiting in our diets, especially for humans eating a low meat diet. And so typically vegetarians will increase the amount of legumes in their diet in order to make up for a protein deficit. I've listed some common legumes here, but there are many more that are available, even easily in cultivation. And so if we go through our list, we have lentils, which are common in, let's say, Middle Eastern food. Up here in the corner, we have what might be split peas and otherwise are lentils. There are various kinds of beans pictured across the bottom here. We've got the black-eyed peas that we already talked about. Chickpeas or garbanzo beans, which are used for hummus. We have normal peas. We also have things like snap peas or snow peas, which are still in their shells. We can have beans like green beans that are still in their fruit. And we can have peanuts or other ground nuts that grow below ground, but they are still seeds, and they are seeds that are still high in protein. And so all of these, relative to many of our other foods, are going to be high protein foods. Our next category is vegetable-like fruits. By this I mean parts of a plant that are technically fruits. They contain seeds and they grow from the ovary of a flower. However, when we eat them in the culinary sense, we aren't eating them because they're sweet, and we're not typically eating them as a snack or dessert. Instead, we're eating them for their vitamin or mineral nutrition, and we're usually eating them with a savory part of a meal. Examples of this are pretty clear. For example, an eggplant is technically a fruit, botanically speaking. It is a ripened ovary with seeds inside. But we don't eat it as a snack. We typically eat it as part of an entree. Peppers like bell peppers or spicy peppers would also fall into this category. Winter squash mostly falls into this category unless we add a lot of sugar and make it a pumpkin pie. And summer squash, things like zucchini or yellow squash, are also vegetable-like fruits. I would put tomatoes in this category too. There is some sweetness there, but we're mostly eating it with savory foods, not as a sweet snack. Other categories of domesticated plants include fruits that are both botanically fruits and culinary fruits. So I'll just add botanical and culinary. So this would be things like apples and peaches and pears and grapes, strawberries, etc. They are ripened ovaries or other flower parts. They contain seeds, but they are also sweet, and we tend to eat them as snacks or desserts. There's the general category of root vegetables, which we talked about earlier in the semester, and this could be anything from beets to potatoes to sweet potatoes and onions. We have a whole category of herbs and spices, plants that we use for their distinctive flavors, even though we don't tend to eat them in large quantities that have a major effect on our nutrition. There are medicinal plants harvested especially for chemicals in them that have some physiological effect. There are fiber plants that when we're harvesting them for fiber, we're not eating them, but we're using them to make things like, with flax, it could be clothing or it could be linens. Cotton obviously is used for all sorts of fabrics. Hemp can be used for sometimes fabrics, more often things like rope. And then we have ornamental plants. And so this is anything that we have domesticated because it's aesthetically pleasing, and we might be growing it either as a house plant or in our gardens. So that's 10 categories of domesticated plants. We have talked about the process of domestication, and we've talked about the results in the last few slides. I wanted to give you an example of the process of domestication in probably one of our 2 or 3 most important agricultural plants. This is corn. Corn was domesticated from a wild relative called teosinte. They're both grasses, and so teosinte is a wild grass. And they are pictured here. You can see teosinte on the right. And notice in this picture, teosinte has many stems, and it's got many small leaves. It has a sort of bushy appearance. And you can see, I'll show you another picture of this, but it has fairly small inflorescences that give rise to these very small ears that have, it looks like, maybe a dozen or 2 seeds inside. A corn plant, on the other hand, has a single branch. It has larger leaves, and it's going to make larger ears. Here's a picture showing the ears of teosinte on the left, ears of an actual cultivated corn plant on the right, and a hybrid between the two in the center. So you can see how dramatically the ears have changed from the wild relative to the fully cultivated plant. This list here is a list of major changes going from teosinte to corn. And I think we just talked about them, but to see them in writing, we first have an increase in the size of the ears. That's dramatically obvious. We have a loss of individual protective covers around each seed. So in the teosinte, there would be some bracts that surround each of these seeds, and that would prevent herbivores from eating it, but would also make it hard for humans to get the seeds off, or if we were to eat the whole thing, it would make it hard for us to digest. There's a loss of branching, and we saw that on the previous diagram, where teosinte had many side stems, corn has few or none. We've talked about the importance of shattering. Teosinte is going to have its seeds shatter or fall off of this central stem here. Corn is going to have its seeds retained on until we do something to knock those seeds off. So corn cobs do not shatter. So these are several changes, and these changes might be very hard to accomplish if there were many genes involved and each one had a small effect. It turns out that genetically speaking, most of these changes are primarily governed by one or just a very few genes, and there might be some other genes that have a smaller additional effect. But this made it easy during the process of cultivation for a dramatic change like small ears to big ears to occur. It didn't require many genes change. It just required that one or a couple do so. I showed you this map earlier showing where plants were domesticated, but also showing where the plants spread after domestication. What we're going to talk about now is a little bit about the patterns of spread. Let's go back to where we were. Plants have spread since cultivation, probably very soon after the process started. But one of the most important periods of the spread of plants worldwide was the Columbian Exchange. So this refers explicitly to the spread of plants that occurred after Europeans started coming to the New World. The New World refers to North and South America, as well as the Caribbean islands. So the spread of plants happened extremely quickly after this initial contact. Many European plants were brought over to the New World because as Europeans colonized in North and South America, they wanted to bring plants they were familiar with. But another reason that Europeans came and made expeditions through the New World was to learn about the plants. Plants were valuable resources that could be used back in Europe. And so Europeans brought New World plants back with them. And many things now that we would think of as traditional foods in Europe actually only got there after this initial contact between Europe and North and South America. Some examples: corn we think of as an important crop in the Americas, but when corn was brought over to Europe, it was an incredibly important crop for Europeans. And there was actually a whole outbreak of disease based on the fact that Europeans didn't know how to prepare it in a nutritionally appropriate way. And so that was called pellagra, if you want to read more about that. Potatoes obviously were brought over and became an important source of carbohydrates and proteins. We talked about this already in relation to the Irish potato famine, when the potatoes got a disease that they were not genetically resistant to that was also brought over from the New World, and it started to wipe out potato crops in Ireland. Other examples of this, though, would include things like tomatoes and peppers and eggplant. At least, to be careful, tomatoes and peppers would have been brought over from the New World to Europe and are now central in, let's say, Italian cuisine, but Italians would not have even had tomatoes before the Columbian Exchange. Additional crops were unfortunately brought over as part of the African slave trade. And so there was movement from Africa to North America. When slaves were brought, then crops were brought with them. And so this is when we got things like black-eyed peas, as well as crops like watermelon and okra. So all of these are now considered Southern cuisine in North America, and that probably relates partly to the appropriate climate in South America being more similar to the African climate. And this probably also relates to the fact that culturally, these would have more likely been important crops for the slaves that were brought over. Related to the spread of plants, the last topic I want to address is the mystery of the sweet potato. We think that the sweet potato spread from South America to Polynesia. Polynesia are the series of islands throughout the Pacific, going from, let's say, the coast of South America over to Australia and up to Asia. So how did this spread occur? To address this, I want you to read the linked article here, and this link should be available for you on our course software. And this is a short article that talks about evidence about how this spread occurred, and it also has some intriguing suggestions about additional evidence provided by chickens. So read this as part of today's course material. I will end today's lecture with some final thoughts about the origins of agriculture. First, the development of agriculture allowed high-density settlements for the first time, so many humans living in close proximity. This undoubtedly had all sorts of effects on society. So it probably allowed complex societal structures. It probably allowed increased division of labor, for example, where some people were more involved in growing plants, other people might have been more involved in processing or storing plants or other roles. It probably also increased the hierarchy within societies, where some people were more in charge and other people had to follow instructions, which has both benefits and some drawbacks. As soon as we started storing food, we needed a way to track how much we were storing and where. This led to two things: the development of number systems and also of writing. I'm going to add number systems here. So society as it exists today wouldn't be like it was if it was not for agriculture. Second, the two most important plant groups in terms of food production are undoubtedly the grains, which are the grasses. These, in terms of just sheer volume of what we eat and what we grow for livestock, are going to dwarf all other plant groups. To emphasize this, think about wheat, rice, and corn as being the primary staple in most cultures. The second most important plant family for cultivation is the legume family, which includes the beans, and we talked about why this was in terms of nitrogen fixation. I want you to look at your book where it lists the crops that were cultivated in different regions around the world where cultivation happened. And when you look through that list, I want you to notice that there are beans in, I think, all of those lists, and there's some sort of grain or sometimes a pseudo-cereal in all or nearly all of those lists as well. I also want to emphasize that crops did not stay put once they were cultivated. They were traded and they were probably raided, but they spread around the world. And now, if you eat any particular cuisine, let's say some Asian cuisine or an African cuisine or some particular European cuisine, it will be full of foods that would not have occurred in that region probably 300 or 400 years ago. I'll also end by emphasizing that while we have a huge diversity of crop plants, we now also have worldwide commerce, which makes it really easy for us to trade food and trade our crop plants. This is starting to lead towards a simplification in our agricultural system. So we are growing the same few plants in many parts of the world, but that also means we're growing fewer kinds of plants. So there's been a homogenization. Everything is becoming more similar in our crops and our agriculture. And that can be good to the extent that those plants that we're growing are the most useful. But it can be bad to the extent that we start to lose other crops, which would give us some redundancy and diversity should there be a problem with the crops that we rely on most now.